Good morning. Continuing our review and summary of conclusion of Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We are on page 1452, Aleph Taf Nun Beis. I will continue. Let me just say this, just on a technical note, change of plans. My trip to Israel has been postponed, so next week I will be here all week. That's due to President Milei. I was going with him, and he's postponing his trip, so we'll go at a later date. And just let you know, since I mentioned yesterday that I won't be here next week, I will be here. Please God. But the following week, after that, I will be going to Mexico City. So you can mark your calendars. Good. With that, let's continue where we are. Where are we up to? So it's all in the middle of the explanation why Shema, Krishma, is called Divshi, my honey, which she will get back to on the next page, actually, on 1453. So meanwhile, in a rather relatively lengthy explanation in the importance that in the Aveda of the contemplation and comprehension of godliness, of Hashem Echad, namely Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, that it be filled with passion and vitality, pleasure. The words were chayis v'einig, tam v'einig, satisfaction, passion. I think I said that word. And he explained that relatively at length again, the importance of that, because it's not just about understanding, it's about bringing it into action. And I mean by action here, not necessarily action as in doing a mitzvah, but it's a mitzvah v'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, love, a palpable, tangible love to godliness. It's very different than just understanding its value. So we have many things in life, as we've been discussing example after example, where we understand its value and we appreciate it even. But it's not necessarily something you personally love and you're personally invested in beyond your comprehension. So we've been going through this in detail, the different scenarios. And yes, we do now have also the additional point that every neshama has a natural, what he called, has tam v'einig, belakus, and that's the cause of our saga. But that still doesn't mean that we don't need contemplation, and it still doesn't mean we don't need a contemplation with tam v'einig. So just adding that we already have something inherent in us. It's not coming from scratch. In other words, it's not acquiring a whole new skill. It's a skill you could say, a personality that's already part of us, part of the neshama, but it needs to be activated. Like he made it clear that the ikar is that it has to come bizgalus belibe. So how does it come revealed bizgalus belibe? So that's through a proper contemplation, but that's not enough. You also need the tam v'einig. It can be cold and detached, and the more you go deeper into it, like he called it primius bina, the more einig they'll come from it. So then the piece that we learned yesterday continues. It says that's what it means. Ema bonim smecha. Ema bonim, the mother of the children, is besimcha, is celebrating, is joyous, joyful. The ema bonim goes on bina. That when bina is smecha, when bina has this tam v'einig and is celebrating and is enjoying, not just serving its role as a mother, then it becomes ema bonim. Then it gives birth to children. In this case, the children are the midas. So ivdus Hashem b'simcha shilei chayz v'einig godel be'elakus hamusig. And then he explains, when a person really concentrates and immerses themselves, and binds themselves in the inyan that they're learning, like all the language here is very important because he really spells out, he describes it in detail, that entire immerses himself, and he comes closer to the inyan of the key well, and it internalized, integrated, it settles in a good way and an internal way. The three things he said. Then he will rejoice in it, he will take pleasure in it, and he will live with it. It lives within him. It's another way, a living entity that's alive. Strong pleasure and satisfaction in the soul. And through that comes a leidus hamidas shebelev. And that creates the Eim Habonim, that smecho creates the Eim Habonim, the leida, the birth of the midas. Achzeo b'tanai, here he uses the word. This condition, kasher ha'enugu bizgalus belev. Condition for this to be effective is that it has to be bizgalus belev. It can't remain just dormant or concealed or hidden in any way. Whereas if the hasaga is only in his mind, and he does not have a spadus in the heart, emotionally he's not getting affected by it, and he explained the parentheses that what does it mean? That herigish b'moyach, he still can sense and enjoy it in his mind on a cognitive level. He called it akoros sein, and he recognizes it, which is more than just comprehending it. It resonates with him. And he explained that's the das that connects Chachma to Bina. So all that is there. And that causes that Chachma enter more into Bina, like he said. Or you have the level of Riyah de Chachma, like a visualization, the truth, the resonance of the visual of Chachma, that type of clarity. But if it ends shaykh l'midas shebelev, so with all that, that's still all the cognitive process, cognitive clarity, if you wish. And then comes the das that connects meichin to midas, that he actually feels the alakus in his heart. So it's an emotional, personal experience of godliness. And he said, so too with the pleasure in a deeper inner comprehension, which is Pnimius Bina in general. If it only be in the mind, lo yiyem zeleidus hamidus. There won't be a birthing of emotions if it just remains in the mind. It has to come bizgalus libay, that he's enjoying it, he lives in it. And he gives the example like a person during a time of celebration, be'ez simcha. I gave the example sometimes of Chassidus is the wedding of a child. But any simcha that we see, the simcha opens up the channels of midas. Lefazer hein rav, that whoever is in that state of simcha is in a very expansive mode. And they splurge. Hein rav, great treasure or great amount. Even to the point that a person who by nature is stingy, chili, v'kamtzen b'yeser, increasingly so, even he has his galus midas chesed and can be transformed, at least for that time, into another type of person, the ishacher. I mean, that's all when the simcha is bizgalus lalev. We're not just talking about the hypothetical in the mind, that you actually are in a state of joy and simcha. So here he clearly is distinguishing between simcha and tainug. Before it was more all generally all in one category. But obviously there's the difference between simcha and tainug. Simcha is far more expressive. Tainug is far more internal. When I say internal, not hidden necessarily, but all this has to come out in a revealed way. Tainug belev, oz yeh leidus v'izgalus hamidas shebelev. I believe that's where we stopped. So then the lady of Izgalus Hamidas Shebelev, that will be, the birthing of the Midas. Now, obviously, before I continue, just as an introduction to the parentheses, you could ask the question, is it possible without Tam V'Einig in the contemplation that a contemplation should go into the Midas regardless? There was a person It's not. I mean, it's not It's not a necessity. It's not necessarily so. And with tam v'enig, there's no question. It's much more likely because that creates that vitality, whereas it doesn't remain a cold, aloof, abstract concept. So he's going to touch upon this somewhat in the parentheses. So let's learn now the parentheses, which is the line that begins at Tainuku Belev. It's around 2/3 of the way down the page, 1452. And if you want to follow the text, if you don't have a sefer, you can go to ayinbeis.com. All the pages are scanned there. So now he adds like this. I just want to add one more thing before I continue. Remember, we learned this all the first time in depth and at length. So I'm not necessarily going in as much as I did the first time because it's recorded and you could always check it out. It was a few years ago. And there are parts I even either skipped or just reviewed orally instead of reading all the text. Here I feel more important to read it inside, all of it, because it's coming back to a key point of how Shema, the contemplation of Hashem Echad, brings to V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha. So it's pretty much a very central theme in this whole discussion. All the details, obviously, I don't want to say they're all necessary, but since we learned it already, I'm not going into the same level of analysis. But we will go through it and just understand the pshat, and if you want, no problem. You can go back to see the how I explained it the first time, which probably was more at length. So he says like this now: Uba madrega zu, on this level, hu benakol yeser mebechitzenius hasaga. He's explaining now a little different than what I said before, but we'll get to that as well. Remember, he made a distinction between a more superficial and surface level understanding, what he called Bitsanius. He called that earlier on the last page, just looking it up. He called it Chitzenius Levad. So then the Chayes Ve'enig, he says Ma'at Mazir or Mezoyer. It's more diminished, which makes sense. Even though you understand the idea, but the more surface it is, the tam v'enig will be directly impacted. Whereas a person who completely immerses themselves, just give an example. Let's take an example of a song. Same as in reading a book. You listen to a song just in passing. You're doing something else. You're not concentrating. You may have pleasure in it, but it's very different if you sit down and you completely immerse yourself and you cut off and everything else is. You move a little, you eliminate all distractions, you're going to take a lot more pleasure, obviously, in it. And therefore, it's going to affect you much more. So he's saying now like this. Remember, before he used the word hasaga, pnimius habina. So he's explaining more about what that achieves. In addition to the tam v'enig, the very pnimius is easier, because why? And he's adding a new point that he hasn't made before. Okay, let me explain what this means before you translate. Meitzer HaGodin is the channel. It literally means the narrow throat. So even though physically the brain is here, the mind is here, the emotions are in the heart. So even though physically the throat doesn't seem to be a connection between Moich and Midas, but Chassidus explains, because everything in the physical physiology of the human being is created in the divine image. So every physical structure reflects a spiritual structure. So if something gets narrow, and we've learned this, if you may recall, some of you in volume 2, where he talked about the different parsois, partitions, like the partition of the diaphragm. He talked about the partitions, the membranes in the brain. He also talked about the partition of Meitzer HaGodin. So interesting, Meitzer, like from the word Mitzrayim. And often Mitzrayim is explained that way. The Meitzer HaGodin is essentially a partition, or I would say call it more of a narrow channel that separates between Moichin and Midas. So Chassidus explains in many places that when a person has difficulty taking an idea and turning it into an emotion, which we all are challenged with, just because we contemplate or know about God doesn't mean you suddenly feel love for God, which is what we're discussing here. So that's called the Meitzah HaGadon between Moichin and Midas. So he's saying in the Chitzenius Hasaga, that Meitzah HaGadon, that narrowness, has more effect. But in Pnimius, like he says, the Pnimius, this narrow channel does not matzir, but from the word atzir, does not pause or stop or block. And ma'akiv is like block or impede. It doesn't as much. It's still a challenge because you still have to move it from Pnimius Hasaga to Midas. But that's what he's adding. Till now, he hasn't spoken about the Meitzah HaGadon. He didn't speak about the difficulty bringing from Moichin to Midas. He just said that Moichin needs, first of all, Pnimius and Tam V'Einig to bring it into Midas. But now he's adding this point. U'kamoi b'derech memela mispashit ba'moich alalev. And it's as if it's like almost automatically. It's only kamoi. He's not saying automatically, but it's much easier, the process. Why? Because like I just gave the example with song. If you're listening to something superficially, more the chitzenius, it still can have an impact on you. But it's a whole different story if you immerse yourself entirely and the pnimius, not just you immerse yourself, but also you're going into the depth of the idea. You're letting it completely engulf you and you submerge yourself in it. So then the Meitzah HaGadon does not have that much impact. And it's like much more natural that from the Moich it will go to the Lev. V'hainu. And this means mipnei shebezem meir yesur mebchinas ha'etzem. So he's explaining because that pnimizdike immersion is causing that there should be it will radiate more from the etzem. Remember, the etzem nefesh has tam va'einig, the neshama. We explained earlier in the previous page parentheses. So, but the etzem remains concealed. It's in a inherent state or innate state, but it's not necessarily revealed. But once you start contemplating, and especially a contemplation, like he says here, a soga pnimius, and under a comprehension, a deeper inner comprehension, then what's happening is the dynamics are it's accessing more of the etzem, and therefore it's pushing the intellectual stimulation into the midas, so to speak. He doesn't use that word, but that's what it means, that it's flowing. And in addition to that, mipnei sheyeshka b'chinas hadas. The Rebbe Rashab, in his classic style, dissecting every detail, there's another element that it triggers when you have pnimius. That because you have das, and remember, das is iskashus. Das is not just understanding something, but connecting you, binding you to it. Like I gave the example with the reader and the literate and the illiterate, that if it's my father, it's mine, it's negayed to me. Negayed b'nefesh, so it's a das v'iskashus, shem ha'mekusher, that he's bound, v'takua b'yeser. But Inyan, Tekua is like deeply embedded or immersed in the Inyan. B'hainu shenafshe Tekua u'mekusher ba'ina leki b'chol keicheseha. That means his spirit, his soul, is immersed or embedded or even completely internalized and bound the Inyan Eliki that we're contemplating on, b'chol keicheseha, with all his faculties, not just partially, not just superficially, but entirely. That's what he adds in the parentheses. So actually, it does not touch upon what I said before. Before I said the question is, can you reach this only with hasaga, without tam va'einig? So you can strike that. I thought that what he's going to touch upon, but I see he's not. That's something that we can talk about, but right now that's not what he's addressing. So he addressed this. Umidas elu. That's the parentheses. Before I continue, let me see if there are any questions. Let me stop here for any questions.
What would be the I don't know, Balabatisha, more simple understanding of what the Meitzar Hagaron does. I mean, I understand it's a constriction that impedes the ability of cognitive understanding to lead to emotional excitement, if you will, or passion. I understand what it says, but what would what would that impediment be? Just to say it's constrained, but what's the constraint? I mean, I understand
Well, we
with a
spoke at
throat.
length.
Yeah,
There's so many
yeah.
different ways. You could either be just hide behind mind games, where a person
Ah,
doesn't want to personally get involved and be vulnerable. I mean, you can go the list goes on. Every possible reason that people don't allow themselves to be personally involved in something. Lack of commitment. It could be fear, insecurity. It could
mhm.
be, as I said, vulnerability. All the reasons why often people understand something, but you don't see them living up to it, and
I
uh,
see.
and emotionally committing.
And is that a manifestation of Nefesh Bahamas is doesn't want to be schlepped into that level of emotion?
Not completely necessarily. It definitely Nefesh Habamis doesn't help. Definitely has its own agenda. Nefesh Habamis is also against you even contemplating, let alone feeling. Meitzah Garin is part of the natural way we were created. That for us to be human beings, God created many partitions, and things travel. And there are different channels, and many cases, certain schisms that we have to overcome in our avodah. So,
Excellent. Yeah.
I mean, Nefesh Habamis can be part of it. That I would go and look up in other places where it's more discussed. This is discussed at length in many Maimarim. Here he's just touching upon it very briefly, to be honest. So if you want a fuller picture of this, I would go look up Meitzah Garin, Meichen Amidis, in Sefer Likutim, or other places. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Umidas Elu, to continue on, and these emotions that are born out of this process, Hein Lamaylim B'chinas Hamidis Dechitzenius Asog. So now he's saying Chitzenius Asog, like we said, can also bring a form of midas. But when it comes from Pnimius, it's higher. Because Shazeo Chitzenius Halev. So he's adding yet another point. So Chitzenius Hasaga touches the Chitzenius Halev. It's like also if it's more surface level in your mind, it's also going to be surface level in your emotions. The Ibchinis Ava Hasuya. And that's like the manufactured, the produced, the acquired love that he mentioned before. If you remember, all the way on the top of the paragraph in page 1451. Let me just look it up. I want to just use that expression. I want to just see if he's using it in the same context.
Bottom of 249, about 10 lines up from the bottom.
What page
I'm
is
sorry,
it?
1449. I'm sorry. It's just sorry. 249th page of the PDF, but it's 1449. 10 page, about 10 lines up from the bottom.
Okay.
The line begins with Baderach.
Yeah, I think it's a different context there. There he says l'chol avavcha as opposed to b'chol nafshecha. That was the difference between the Shvatim and the Ovis. Okay. Yeah, you could associate it there. So correct, on page 1449. So that's Avasuya. That's Chitzenius Halev. Avamidas Hanal, but the midas that come from Pnimius HaSaga, Heim Bechinas Chayes V'tainug, Shemisanig Ala Lakus, there with the vitality and that pleasure and satisfaction, that has pleasure in godliness, the chafetz be'emes belikus, and truly desires in godliness. It's like a true, real desire. V'hi amitisi in hamidus, and this is the true purpose, if you could say, or function of the midus. Hainu shechafetz mitzad atzmei, lo rak mitzad hechrech haseichel. So now he's adding, it's not just due to the hechrech haseichel. He mentioned that also, kfir. You could have the mind really pushes you. The mind can be so compelling and make a case that you should get emotionally involved. But you want it to be deeper than that. You want the midas themselves to feel the value of it. So it begins with his bonus, that's for sure. That's the catalyst. But ultimately, you want it to be lo mitzad hechrech, mitzad atzmei. The midas themselves really value this. Only not just to the hechrech haseichel, because the seichel made a strong enough case, shemechayev es hamida, that compels that this midah should be there. You could have that as well. The seichel does have that ability. Im shalev atzmei chefetz belakus. So we're at a point, another additional point that he's making, that the heart itself is desiring godliness, which only tells you even more about the interface, because you don't want it to be coming from an outside force. It could, like we learned before about light. The light, outside light, allows the eye to see in the dark, but the eye itself sees. So the same thing here, the heart itself feels. And he qualifies. Even though this too, even when the heart feels it on its own and values it, now it becomes so internalized that the emotions value it on their own, even though that too comes from the comprehension and from the contemplation, being that the chayas v'enik is now also in the heart, not just in the mind, this vitality and pleasure, shalev misanegal elakus, that the heart feels and pleasure, it takes pleasure in godliness. Harihalev atzmei chayfetz be'emes belakus. So even though is the mind that brought it there and led it to that place, but now once the emotions are involved, it itself, the emotions themselves truly desire godliness. Like explained elsewhere, like it's explained elsewhere, and was also explained earlier. Yes, I remember that. I have to find exactly where, but he said it a few times in different type of terms. So many examples for this. The most obvious example would be, you can have a person who's a very intelligent person, makes a case for something, and persuades you because simply due to the logic and due to the proofs that he brings to the table or she brings to the table. But you could say, you know what? Okay, you proved it to me, but it's not resonating within me. I'm not denying the truth of it, but I'm not feeling it like on my own. But then there's a point where you're so convinced and it becomes so much part of you that even though it began because someone so-called persuaded you or someone made a good case for it, it then becomes, you own it. It becomes yours to the point that you say, now it is mine. It's something that I completely identify and relate to. That's a little more in Seichel, what I just gave an example. But the same idea can be applied to Seichel and Midas. So you can see here, this is quite a profound psychological dissecting of how human beings work. So you could have all these levels. I mean, I didn't really map it out in that type of structure, but if you think about it, you see here many different ways how people experience things. They can understand something and it doesn't affect their emotions. They can understand it and affects to some extent. It could affect it, but not because the emotions themselves are appreciating, but it's more, the mind is like telling you it's the right thing. If you think about it in Tanya, even though in Tanya it's in different language, when he gets to Perek Tazayin, chapter 16, and he starts talking about someone who's unable to reach a point where their mind is actually giving birth to full-blown emotions, what he calls mides bizgalus libe. He says at least the contemplation can affect them that you osaloi. He called it the talumas libe, that your mind is telling your emotions, and your emotions feel this. I don't feel love directly to God, but I feel it's appropriate, it's a fitting thing to love God. So he explains that that's also a form of midas, but still talumas libe. Then he speaks about a level that's even lower than that, where you don't feel anything. You can understand, but it doesn't affect your emotions. So I'm just pointing out that Chassidus, and here is also, this is contributing to it, With the Rebbe Rashab, of course, with all his knowledge, and he's not writing just simply for beginners, he's spoken about for the whole comprehensive picture, he's laying out the different scenarios, but all in the context of what he wants to say here, which is all about the chayes ve'enig, because he wants to bring that this bonus comes into midas. The bottom line is, after all said and done, just keep one thing in mind. This is the Kudus HaChachma and all this bina, and that is that you come from a contemplation to an actual midah that you love ahaftas Hashem Echad. That's its actual love. Now, when you think about it, most of us, when we say Shema, and the way it's said in most shuls by minyanim, and I don't think how many people give thought to all of this, and definitely don't have it's so rushed. I mean, Shema said basically takes around 5 seconds from Shema to Vahafta. So I don't think in 5 seconds you can achieve anything close to what he's describing here. Not Pnimius, for sure not. Even Chetzenius Halev and Chetzenius HaSogit. But obviously, he's describing the way it should be, not the way it's done, the way it should be done. So just wanted to add that in case anybody's wondering. So with that, he concludes the paragraph. Let me stop again for any questions. And we can then continue. Vizehu. And now he goes back to Vahafta of Krishna. After explaining this whole process of how you get to Ava, actual love. I'll just share one interesting interaction I had with an individual. I was traveling to Boston and someone wanted me to see a family member that was a brilliant guy, literally a prodigy, especially in technology, like a scientist, but emotionally almost completely detached. So they wanted me to, so I had a long conversation with him. And a brilliant guy, even understands emotions, but understands it from the mind's point of view. It's like, the example they give about the blind person who so mastered his environment that if you came to his home, you wouldn't know he's blind because he memorizes every room, every inch of his house. So you walk with him and he's showing you, this is the kitchen, this is that, watch out, there's this chair here. But he was totally blind. So his mind had memorized everything. So you could have the same idea, an intellectual whose mind is so brilliant, he could also figure out the science of emotions. However, that's not the same thing as emotions. So I had a conversation with him about that. And he was surprised to hear that there's a thing called emotions that are emotions on their own, that you actually love something, not because your mind loves it and because your mind is telling you that it's worthy of loving, or the mind is even so-called simulating a form of emotion. He really thought that was the only reality. I mean, I concluded that he's probably on some form of spectrum, not that, God forbid, not to criticize. So I don't think he had control over this, but it was interesting how he saw midas through the lens of Meichid. And completely, it was almost like, something. I was actually surprised that a person actually does. I even asked him. I said, does a song stimulate you? And he answered me, that's not the song that stimulates. He just knows the symmetry of the song is for him calming and harmonious. So I'm not going to say he doesn't have emotions. Every human being has emotions, but there was a certain, I don't know, maybe the Meitzah Garden is very deep there, or other factors. Maybe fear, probably been hurt in his life as well. But I'm not analyzing him. I just wanted to say that I saw a situation where a person's midas were seen almost completely through the lens and through the vantage point on the perspective of Meichid. But Vahafta does not mean that. Vahafta means you're actually loving God. A real love, a real palpable love. What our challenge is, for most of us, we have many things we love. But it's much easier to love something of Gashmi, something you see, something you relate to. Comes to God, the challenge is not so much the idea that we love and not just understand, is all around us. If you love your spouse, you love your children, you love things. I'm not talking about anything forbidden or prohibited. There are many things that we have developed a love to or attracted to, whatever the reasons are. So we understand it. The challenge here is to apply that to Elokus. That's why you need so much contemplation, because Elokus is foreign to us. Even though it's inside our nefesh, but it's not something we're accustomed to. It's not what we learn about. Think of the years that you went to school, all your formative years. How much about God was discussed even? So if you had the home or your own instincts, maybe you got something. Even holidays, Shabbos, Yom Tov, Pesach, and so on. Most people never had real exposure to Elokus to the point that they should love it. So it's like a foreign concept. So you're telling me to love something I don't even know about. It's like asking people on a different planet who don't drink water to love a cold, refreshing drink of water. They don't even know what it is. Now, in our case, obviously, every neshama has some inclination, and we can begin to appreciate something transcendent. But this is ultimately the goal: is to love God as we love physical things, gashmis. So now he's continuing now back to Shema. So he says, "Zeu ikad inyan v'ahavta shebekrishma." And this is the primary meaning in inyan, in the love that we say in Krishma, v'ahavta Hashem Echad, after Shema Yisrael and Baruch Shem, shehi liyas ha'ava amitis, not just ava, like he said, chitzenis, a true love. Hainu ha'ava shebchinas tainug lisanag al Hashem. So it's an ava that has a pleasure in it, to have pleasure in God. So we're going to learn, we have learned, there's a concept of ava b'tainugim. You could have love that doesn't yet have really full tainug. And then there's ava b'tanugim, which is, of course, a far higher, maybe one of the highest levels, if not the highest. Now, what's the difference between ava and ava with tainug? You could say, one second, I love something. Yeah, you can love something and not necessarily have full pleasure in it. Doesn't mean you have pain. Doesn't mean you don't have pleasure, but it means that's not like the same, I'll find the right words for it shortly. Maybe we should read here. Let me see how he's going to explain it here. But I'll explain what this means, ava with tainug. Let's first read what the Rebbe Rashab says before I give my explanation. Who and how do you get to that state? Idea is bonus ba Hashem Echad. Through the contemplation on Hashem Echad and Shema. Atzmus Ein Sof. Now he's taking us back to a few pages back when he spoke about Ma'arich Be'echad in detail, that when a person contemplates how Atzmus Ein Sof, Atzmus, Hu Hayesh Amiti, he is the true reality. Not we are he's the true Yesh. Ukula Kamei Kala Chashiv Mamish. And everything in his presence before him is like Kala, is nullified. Is ayin. We look at life that I'm the yesh, I exist, and the ayin is the mysterious non-existence of something beyond us. But this contemplation, we're learning that Atzmus, we contemplate that Atzmus is the true reality, and everything else is nothingness. The Kol HaGiluyim, because all the revelations, the Chol HaIshtalshlus, and the entire cosmic order, Afilu b'madreges hayeser el yenis, even in the highest levels, they're completely, infinitely distant and apart from Atzmus. Or in this case, completely insignificantly infinitely insignificant compared to Atzmus. So kala is like kemoy loy, that's kala, loy, and ayin. So earlier we learned ayin is even deeper than law, but it's basically levels of complete nullification in context of Atzmus. Because he is the only reality and there's no other besides him at all. Utter unity of the divine Atzmus. Now he's not saying this is mamat lamayla, mamayla lamata. It sounds a little mamayla lamata if you ask me, because he starts with Atzmus. He's not going from the bottom up, but the truth is you can get to this contemplation either way. You could either think about it from the top down, or through a process of elimination, go from the bottom up, as we learned in the Hamayrik Be'echad, Mamat Lamayla, and the Kadim Lichte Lamayla Lamata. So this is the contemplation, and he's just really summing up what he learned, what he discussed more at length earlier, more length. But He's going back to how we get to Ava Mitis. Ukasher yir gili Hashem Echad, the Liboy. And now, like we said, with the Tam V'Einig, when this Gili Hashem Echad enters and becomes, when this will become something that enters in a revealed way into the heart, when this contemplation that we just mentioned, that we just described, is felt and radiates in the heart, in this heart, so not just conceptually that you know this, but your heart senses and feels emotionally that there's nothing but God. And there's no other life. That's true life. Everything else is not just nonsense. It's completely meaningless. That there's no other real life and there's no there's no other pleasure at all. The mili b'shamayim v'imcha lecha fatzti. That's the pasuk that the famous pasuk in Tehillim, where he's referring to that. What do I have? The imcha lecha fatzti. I don't want anything but you. Ta'kolu kula mamish. What do I have in heaven? I want Atzmus itself. Because everything is nullified in that presence. So in other words, when you appreciate true reality, so the created reality that we're so familiar with becomes insignificant. When the Frierdiker Rebbe, for example, told his captors in Yiddish that this toy, this gun, could only frighten someone that has one world and many gods, but not someone who has one God and many worlds, or two worlds. It wasn't just a nice line. The Frierdiker Rebbe's reality, there's God. You're not going to frighten me, even though, of course, he wanted to live. And al piteri, you have to do everything possible to live. Wasn't interested, God forbid, in taking his life. But you can't frighten me because my reality is not, if you're taking away Gashmis, it's not like I lose my reality. I've given a number of talks titled, "Is your self-worth defined by your net worth?" And I point out, I remember when I was a little child, and I read the first time about the Wall Street crash in 1920, what was it? 23, 26?
29.
Okay. You remember? No, I'm just kidding. I understand.
From history.
I got it. You know, Ronald Reagan, in his first State of the Union address, he quoted Abraham Lincoln. And then he said, and just for the record, the media wants truth in true media. I want to make sure you know that I didn't hear it from Lincoln himself, because they talked about Reagan's age. Anyway, back to us here. So I remember asking my father that I read, people were jumping out of windows and, God forbid, committing suicide because they lost their fortunes. And I said to my father, I said, why? Why would they do that? They have a family, they have life, they have a future, they have values. And my father, how are you going to explain it to a little child? He told me, you get older, you'll understand. But bottom line is, because their whole lives were identified. What was their chayim amitim? Money. So they didn't even have the idea of diversification, using a business term. That maybe there are other baskets. All their eggs were in one basket. Who am I if my dignity and my pride and my wealth is taken from me? In other words, their self-worth defined by their net worth. Whereas a person when a person begins to understand godliness, it's not just a religious journey. Its question is, what is reality? Is this reality? You look around. So yes, of course it's reality because God created it. But what true value does it have? So Chassidus explains it has value because God gave it value, not because you and I think it's valuable. So we understand in a world of ego and power and materialism, of course it has value. There are people right now, their whole lives is just the amount of money they make or other pleasures, physical pleasures. But that's why we have Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. We cover our eyes. I'd like to explain that's because like we black out, don't let your eyes looking at the material world distract you, like shutting down your external senses and start contemplating 1 second. What is reality? It's a whole different reality. Hashem Echad. Now, of course, this takes a lot of contemplation, a lot of learning chassidus. You don't just in a second suddenly transfer the reality of the physical world to the reality of God. But here he's summing up. That's why it's Hamayrik Be'echad. You extend this contemplation. And when you do, he says to the point that your heart, you actually emotionally are experiencing this Eined Mulvade. Raki hu levade hu chayecha. Only he alone is your true sustenance, your true life, vitality. Shu mokar ha'chayim u mokar ha'tanugim. Because he's the source of life and the source of all pleasures. I'm going to stop here because I have a real tight schedule I have to go to in a minute. But if anybody has a quick question, I'm happy to take it. If not, we can do it tomorrow. We can continue tomorrow.
Just a comment. Just a comment that unfortunately it's not just money. I mean, it's everything. If people don't have that connection, I think it's very hard.
I just use money as an example. I didn't say
yeah, no.
It could
no,
be,
I know.
It could be a carnal pleasure. It could be sex. We see what people are addicted to and what they're connected to.
Right.
Absolutely, you can fill in the blanks. Yeah,
such a challenge to just keep remembering that. Not a challenge, but
that's why we have an Ayin Beis that's over 1,400 pages long.
Thank God. Okay,
I'm going to stop here at the bottom of page 1452. I apologize that I have to run. I just realized what time.